Uh-oh, watch what we say.
Okay.
It's nice it has that little reminder to pop up. I probably would forget too. How are we doing?
Okay.
Interesting. Lot to think about.
I think he's a really interesting guy.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah.
He really is. Yeah, I'm glad you introduced him to us.
I just love this guy, just his whole demeanor and his thought process.
Yeah, he's charming as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good word.
Creative
Yes, he's charming. I rarely use that word,
and,
but that's a
and
good
such
word for him.
and yeah, there's a lot of positive energy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess that's what I'm sensing. Yeah.
Yeah, he would be a great professor to study under for sure too.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll just give it a couple of minutes.
Mhm.
Let people straggle in. Ah, no. Okay.
How many do we have?
Well, there are 10 people registered for the class.
Oh,
So
there are a number of them.
we only had 5 of you. I think it was just 5 last time. So hopefully we'll have a couple more. Oh, okay. Sure doesn't feel like October.
What does it feel like?
No.
Just noticing the weather is just so nice.
Yes, it is.
Well, it's
Think
raining now.
of October and rain.
Not here.
It's raining where I am.
Oh, where's that?
Sort of mini ridge.
Huh. Oh my, wow, that's wild. I'm in West Seattle. It's really sunny here.
Oh,
Seattle does have
sunny?
these
Sunny?
microclimates. Hmm.
It's raining here in Woodinville too.
Oh, wow. Okay, you guys are a little bit farther inland than me.
Well, not on First Hill.
Not raining there?
I'm on First Hill, yes.
Yeah. Huh.
What is interesting for me is that I'm looking at the church.
Mm-hmm.
From the window, I look at this church. So the two sort of fit together. I've been to that church, of course, but it also goes at 12 o'clock. It sounds the bells.
Oh.
We wouldn't have that if we didn't, would we? Or we'd have an atheistic view, but here are the bells. You hear only for a little while.
And these days, it's probably just a recording of bells, not even bells.
Yeah, it is recording, a total recording.
Oh,
And
that's right.
some people are really annoyed by it. I'm not.
Well, all right. I think we'll just get going and see what we can figure out from this. Let's see. What I have today is from YouTube, but it's just audio. But I think I still need to share the screen in order for you all to hear it. So let's see what happens with that. No need to move that. Come on. No. There we go. Okay. Are you seeing that?
Yeah.
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 Okay. So here, they had a little preview stuff, but it just starts right in with him introducing Martin or saying hi.
Martin Haggland, welcome to the Dig.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
There is a lot going on in your book. So I want to start by sketching out the basic outlines of it piece by piece, starting with your argument for what you call secular faith and against religious faith. The end of your book, the second half, has a lot of politics in the sense that we normally discuss politics on this show, but the first half is an argument for a sort of meta politics that fundamentally structures everything. We have one life here on earth. Because of that, our lives have meaning precisely because they are finite. And the things we attach meaning to and strive to achieve require something you call secular faith, which depends on the possibility that those people or commitments that we commit ourselves to might be lost or fail. And so who we are and strive to be is fundamentally a matter of how we decide to use and what we thus do in and with our finite time. Why is this what James Chappell in a Boston review called a meta-ethical principle so important? Why must we understand all questions in this fundamental question of how we spend our finite time?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And it goes right to what I think is the heart of the book, because I want to show from the ground up why spiritual questions can't be separated from material questions and why existential questions cannot be separated from
Okay, let's hold on. I wanted to pause for a second on meta ethics. So meta for philosophy purposes means sort of the next level up. So, and it comes, the origins go to an accident in how Aristotle organized some of his writings. He had this book he called The Physics, where he's looking at how the natural world works. And then there was this other book that he called First Philosophy, but it comes kind of as the step above the ethics, and in Latin, the meta fit. So meta ethics would be the kind of a theoretical step above doing the ethics. And so you're asking in meta ethics, how do we construct ethics? Where in ethics, you're usually asking a question like, what is the right thing for me to do? So meta ethics is how do we go about thinking about what is the right thing to do? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Oh, now what? Now I gotta go back to Google and get it to. This is really...
So would the meta ethics then be sort of the philosophy of ethics?
Yeah, that would be one way to put it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could.
Exploring why and how. Yeah, okay.
So yeah, and so the big disagreements in ethics are should ethics be about principles, which we call deontological, and that comes especially from Kant, or should ethics be about outcomes, which comes from the utilitarian tradition from like Jeremy Bentham and James Mill. And so that argument between them about what's the right way to think about it, that's a meta-ethical argument about the right way to do ethics. Now, somehow I'm sharing things. I don't know what I did, but I've managed to confuse all kinds of stuff. Oh, maybe I can get that to go up. There we go.
economic questions. And that's also how the two halves of the book are going to come together. But to see that on the most fundamental level, we have to see that, like, why do we have economic questions in the first place, in the broad sense, now not just thought about as the economy as a separate sphere, but economical question in terms of like what's valuable, what's worth doing, what do we prioritize, what is important to us. All of those are economic questions in the broad sense because they have to do with, like, again, what we value, how we make the distinction between what is significant and insignificant in our lives. And part of what I want to show in the first half of the book is that whatever, however those economic questions are answered, and those questions of priority and commitment are answered specifically, they require, like, those questions in general could only matter for a being who understands that they have finite time. So there's a question of priority in the first place, of like any of those specific issues of like what's worth doing, what should I prioritize, require a sense that I don't have all the time in the world to do this, that like something is at stake with what I do with my time and what I give my attention to, has an internal relation to the sense that like there can come a point at a time where there's no longer time to do this right. There's no longer time to do justice to this. There's no longer time to care for you and love you. And so that sense of finitude is part of the pathos that goes into all our care and commitment.
Let's talk more about death in particular, the subject of everyone's morbid fascination.
Yes.
You write, quote, "For the question of how I should leave my life to be intelligible as a question, I have to believe that I will die." And, quote,
No.
"Only someone who is torn open by time can be moved and affected. Only someone who is finite can sense the miracle of being alive." And lastly, quote, "My death is the horizon that renders intelligible all temporal relations of my life. If I actually believed that my life would last forever, I could not make any sense of the distinction between sooner and later in my life." Why does believing that our lives matter require that we understand that those lives will come to a full and definitive end with our deaths, and that all that exists as a result, from our bodies to our social relationships and political projects, that all of that depends on active maintenance? Is your argument that our fear of death always directly haunts us, or is it more that this is a fundamental premise of our being in the world that both directly and indirectly structures everything else?
Yes, another excellent question. And in short, my answer is the second, is the fundamental condition. But let me explain how that works, because you zone in very helpfully on a fundamental issue here. And I think to see the contours of the argument, it's helpful to first think about how this works in relation to more particular projects that you care about. So like part of what I'm trying to show in the book, that the determinacy of anything you care about, say like the determinacy of this relationship or running the Dig Show or Brown University, I'm thinking about Providence examples here. All of those things, for there to be any distinct thing that like makes the Dig Show determined that's what it is, and as an object of Dan Denver's commitment, you have to have a sense of like, there are things that you could do or that could happen such that it would fall apart, it would fail, and that sense that could happen that's not, of course, the only reason why you're doing the show. You're doing the show because you want to talk to people and get ideas out and change the world. You know, you're committed to that as an end in itself. That's what's important. But built into that commitment to this as good in itself, as important to do this show, there has to be a sense that like, it could fail to be, it could fall apart, it could cease to be.
Oh, I can certainly attest that that's true. That's a constant, is any particular interview not going to work out? Am I going to say something that people think are stupid? Are people suddenly just going to stop listening to it?
Yeah. And it's important to understand that my argument here is not that this is some neurotic, just psychological neurosis around like, oh, I just want to like make sure that I don't fuck up. You allowed me to curse. You said that.
Yes.
But no. But the idea is just that, like, because I say there are two movements of secular faith. Like, you believe in this as something important in itself, that is meaningful in itself to do. But then, like, built into that, and if you remove that sense of possibility of failure, that it wouldn't even be intelligible that you have to make the show. Because if there's no way it can fail, even if Dan doesn't get up in the morning and show us up in the studio, the show makes itself, So it's not even intelligible as an object of care unless you have that sense of its fragility and that it's dependent on practical activity. And we could run that analysis on all the things we care about. And in terms of like how it's understandable and intelligible to us in the first place, that we have to do something and that this depends on what we do or what we don't do. Now, how that relates to your life is that they're like...
There is a novel, a very humorous novel, but it just occurred to me, I have actually encountered this line of thinking before. And it's in Douglas Adams' book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Have you heard this? Douglas Adams was a comic writer, wrote actually for Monty Python in England, an English guy. So in the book, And actually, maybe it's a series of books, and I forget which book it's in actually in the series, but he introduces a character who through some accident has become eternal. And at first, this character says he just really enjoyed life and outliving anyone and everything, and he would make little bets, small things, and they would pay off big over the long term, and he'd outlive all of his enemies. But then it just after time he just realized, well, but what's the point of that? And so in confronting his eternity, what he ends up realizing is nothing matters anymore by virtue of him being eternal. And he actually ends up trying to destroy the universe as a result in order to escape his eternity, because the eternity becomes a kind of torture to him, a condemnation, where it sounds like such a good thing. But then, once you start to confront the reality of it, you end up where Haggland's ended up. It's like, oh, that's actually not the good thing we might have thought it was. So interesting idea. Yeah, it just occurred to me. I know this idea. What do you know? Douglas Adams. Oh, wait, now I need to go back to the other one.
All of those things you do, you also understand as things that you're doing with your life. The dig is one of the priorities in Dan's life. And now we ask, how is it intelligible to you even that you have a life that you have to care about? And that part of caring about all these other things are ways in which you care about how you're leading your life. Well, for that object of concern, your life, to have any determinacy, it too has to be something that could fall apart, has to be maintained, and hence has to have that relation to death.
And that also depends on me committing to do something with my time excludes doing something else. If we're going to continue with me as an example, I used to be a more ordinary reporter, not in the sense I was always a fairly openly left-wing reporter, but I mean, I did, I reported out stories and wrote them in the way that most print or online journalists do. And I did a lot of investigative reporting, and, these projects mattered to me a lot. And initially, when I started doing this podcast, I kind of did both, and I haven't really reported out a story at this point in quite a long time. So there's a trade-off.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of that trade-off.
Yeah. And that's part of how you can express in practice what your priorities are, And when we're asking the question, like, who are you? Who is Dan? What we're really asking is like, what are your priorities in life?
This is my existential identity.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Like what it means to be Dan is like that. Like, I mean, there are many things that matter to you, but like both what matters to you and what their order of priority is. And again, that's sort of like expression of care and commitment and practical identity is again only possible for a being who is like in the core of his or her being concerned with like, what is worth doing? Is this a waste of my time? How should I cultivate my ability to lead my life? And built into that, there has to be the sense that not only the particular commitment, but the life itself is something that could be lost. So otherwise it couldn't show up as, something that is precious in the first place. Your life couldn't show up as precious unless it was something that could be lost, just as no other person in your life could show up as precious if they couldn't be lost. Just as the dig show couldn't show up as precious unless we could lose it. And so we have to support it on Patreon and so on. Yeah.
Exactly. And my existential identity is the composite of all of these things that you call practical identities. My identity as an activity as the host of this podcast, my relationship with my family, including my partner Thea, my commitment to the Bernie Sanders campaign, which I'm aware probably pisses some people off who like my podcast but aren't quite all on board with that, either because they have some critique from my left or my right, but it's a priority for me because I think that a lot is riding on it. And so it's kind of figuring out how to balance all of these things that make me. And I decide these things not just in terms of a decision, but through my actions.
Absolutely. And that's wonderful. And let me just add a few things to that, because I think it will be helpful also later when we get into the sort of Marx and politics question. There's actually a tripartite distinction here that's very important, is that like all the roles that you take on in life are what I call social roles, because they are like, what it means to be even just taking the bus or going to the grocery store. They're like social norms that structure that and that you have to act in relation to just by doing anything. But then so you have even more social roles than you have practical identities. But then your practical identities are those social roles that you actually value as ends in themselves. So there are many social roles that you have to fulfill to do certain things in today's society, but you wouldn't be sad if we changed society such that you didn't have to fulfill that social role. But, you know, being a reporter, being a partner, being a political activist, all of those things are social roles that for you have the status of practical identities because they are ends in themselves, that it's meaningful in itself to devote time to them. And then the existential identity, what it means to be Dan, is not this additional practical identity. It is the order of priority and the interrelation between all of those. And you can see this easily by just thinking that, like, the reason it's not another practical identity, it's not like you can.
I think it's sort of a subtle point he's trying to make, but he's what he's saying is there isn't a you there that absorbs things. It's that the you is constructed by the things that you have absorbed, the identities that you've accepted, I guess is a better way to phrase it. So I'm not sure it's not a really big issue in terms of his thinking, but I just want to make sure that you're following. That's what he's trying to say is it's a subtle point that you're constructed, not essential. Would be the technical way of phrasing that.
Wake up. Well, today.
Someone have a question?
That's an interesting point because it occurred to me if I'm isolated and nobody tells me who I am, do I know who I am?
Yeah, there are a lot of people would argue no, it's really.
I thought about that when I forgot somebody identified me as something and I forgot what the word was, and I was surprised at that identification. But so then I thought, well, I've gotten feedback throughout my life, beginning as a child, right? I'm told I'm a certain way. You know, whether I misbehave or do good or I'm smart or dumb or pretty or ugly.
Or interested in this or interested in that.
Or this character or that character. So, yeah, if I was all alone, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it's also why hermits are kind of think fascinating to us is because it doesn't seem like it should work. Like, how do you do that? You're going to go and live alone for 5-10 years? What?
Huh? Yeah.
Well, there must also be a difference between being alone and loneliness.
Oh, that's for sure. Those people are probably.
There are a lot of people who are lonely.
They're not.
No. That's if you're. Yeah.
And I think that's why also people go to the church. Because there are people.
Well, at some level, almost anything that we sort of are doing that isn't a matter of immediate survival, you might argue is contributing to that somehow. Really, you know, that we're all out making different social connections in various ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
Today, I'm not going to be a podcast host. I'm not going to be an activist. I'm not going to be a citizen. I'm not going to be a partner. I'm just going to be Dan. There is no such thing as just being Dan because it's not a separate existential identity. But Dan is precisely that ongoing practical relation of sustaining and ordering those practical commitments.
Your book doesn't read like those written by the New Atheists, so I haven't read their books, but I have a sense of how they might read. In part because you don't spend a lot of time arguing why there is no God. Instead, you argue that a higher power and an eternal life or an afterlife, that these things wouldn't even be desirable in the first place. What do you make of the New Atheists, and how does your approach differ?
I mean, there's so many differences. I mean, both philosophically and politically. I think on every score. I mean, and I think one very unfortunate effect that the New Atheists have had is this idea, this association of any sort of thinking about secular understanding of the world in terms of like very politically reactionary or conservative movements. You know, but the most important difference for me has to do with exactly what you mentioned. That for me, my critique of what I call religious ideals is not, again, as you mentioned, primarily that, oh, there is no afterlife, there is no God, there's no higher power, but rather that, like, what in many religious traditions have been seen as lower form of existence, that is to say that we are finite material beings. I mean, all the fragility and precarity that we've just been talking about, that like that is not in itself the highest good. The most desirable state of being would be to overcome that, would be to be in a state of being where, in order to be, again, you don't have to do all of these things, like do the show, all these things that can fail. You would just exist in a way that didn't require this ongoing activity of care that makes you vulnerable to loss and pain and death. And part of what I want to show is that actually, even though it is difficult and hard to be finite, the risk of pain and loss and death is part of why things matter. And this life, this fragile, socially interdependent, material life is the highest good. And we can come to recognize and honor that through collective emancipation.
You critique New Atheists because they, quote, seek to debunk religious faith with scientific knowledge. Yet, a vast number of religious people do not regard their faith as competing with knowledge. While accepting the freedom of scientific inquiry and democratic pluralism, they hold that religious faith is crucial for the spiritual shape and profound meaning of life. An atheism that does not engage this sense of religion will fail to transform deep-seated notions about faith. My question about this is, do you fall into a similar trap as the New Atheists in at least implicitly suggesting that it's a worthwhile political project to go about attempting to convert people to atheism? And obviously, if it's not clear to listeners, right, already, I don't believe in God. We'll get to your arguments about democratic socialism in a lot of depth shortly, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But what do you see as the politics of atheism qua atheism?
Yeah, it's actually quite important in the book that I don't use the term atheism in my own name in the book. Actually, It's been described to me in a lot of reviews, but it's very important that, because this is another important difference between me and the New Atheists, that I'm not trying to divide the world into religious and secular people as two different camps. I'm making a distinction between what I'm calling secular faith and religious faith. And I want to show that like we all have what I'm calling secular faith, and a lot of things that we think require religion is actually better understood in the secular terms that I lay out. So in that sense, it's really a book about what we have in common rather than what about divides us, and also about why, like, insofar as say we're committed to the overcoming of capitalism and the achievement of what I'm calling democratic socialism, that is an object of secular faith in the sense that it's something that depends on us and what we do with our lives and how we transform the social form of our lives. And that's, that struggle you can join whether you identify as religious or secular. And I don't suggest that we start out by disabusing people of their religious faith. I'm just trying to show why, like, we can come to recognize that our life together is the highest good. And that recognition and that faith that our life together is the highest good, it's the faith that we actually practice when we devote ourselves to political struggle and to emancipation.
You take your argument for spiritual freedom to your reading of Marx and your argument for democratic socialism.
Mhm.
And core to that is Marx's argument that socialism is fundamentally about expanding the realm of freedom and maximally reducing the realm of necessity. Explain these two realms and why you believe that understanding them is in turn premised on your argument about recognizing the finitude of our time here on Earth, and thus the question of how we choose to spend the finite time of our lives.
So let me just start, and because it's very, very important to gloss how I understand the distinction between the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity. These terms have a very complex philosophical history and also a complex history in Marx and in Marxist thought. The way I think about them is the following, that, like, what you're doing is that activity is free, is in the realm of freedom when it is an end in itself. When doing it, again, this is what we talked about before too, that, like, it's something that, and that can be very demanding and difficult things that you're doing, and that, like, involve, like, subjecting yourself to a lot of demands and obligations, but you're doing it because you recognize it as intrinsically worthwhile. So the time you spend on it, you take to be worth spending on it. And hence you don't want to reduce that time that you have to spend in the realm of freedom, the time you have to be a writer or an activist or a citizen or a partner and all of these things. Whereas the realm of necessity is defined by those activities that are means to an end, that are mere means to an end, and that we in principle, they might be necessary to do to achieve like an end that is external to the activity. But those are the activities that we're committed to reducing the time we have to spend on. So that's sort of the preliminary opening definition of the realm of freedom.
Yeah, he'll have more to say, but let me also try to help. Adam Smith, in his work, uses the example of someone who works in a pin factory, putting the head on a pin over and over and over for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. You remember when Adam Smith was writing, and that activity is necessary for the life of the person who's doing it because that's how they survive. So it exists in the realm of necessity. Now, Haggland, as a professor, has gone through a lot of trouble, a lot of effort to become educated, to get a PhD, to become a professor, but it's what he wants to do with his time. And so there's some overlap in that he's paid to do it, so it's satisfying some necessity for him. But his primary motive in doing it is it's what he wants to do. And so even though it's difficult and it's hard and he sometimes will be frustrated and not want to do it because of those various demands, in general, it's this activity he's chosen out of his freedom to engage. And what Marx was getting at in how he thought about socialism is that, you know, a la Adam Smith and the pin factory, capitalism wants to put everyone into the realm of necessity and keep them there. So that's what work is that you're going to make the most profit for someone else. But the system wants you as worker to do that. So the capitalist system wants to constantly expand the realm of necessity. But we as free beings want to contract that and expand the realm of freedom. And we're doing things really well for ourselves and things are working out well. When we're like Haggland, we can do both at the same time. But for most people, they're stuck in that realm of necessity. And so the project of socialism is to try to free them from that realm of necessity and open something up. But that's really complicated because at the same time, for society to function, you need people who make pins because we need to pin things, and you need people who take out the garbage. And so it's not like the realm of necessity can ever go away. We still have to do things to survive, and socially things have to happen for us socially to survive, but we can try to aim to minimize those and maximize the freedom.
But then how much, excuse me, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Well, but then it also has to do with the political institutions that we have.
Sure.
I mean, in Europe, it's no wonder that he can write this, really, because he grew up in an earth of socialism.
Yeah. Oh, and he talks about the glory days of Swedish socialism was his childhood.
He does, and so I think it's you know, I'm not surprised that he can write this and can not believe in a God. But in America, we can't overthrow capitalism, and besides that, our whole economy is based on the weapons that we make.
Yeah,
so how are we going to deal with that?
There's a whole trap in there. Now, and admittedly, these are the kind of questions he specifically does not address. And people acknowledge that he knows they're big questions, and they're just not the topic of this book. But yeah, he doesn't actually talk at all about how do we get from here to there. He talks sort of about his analysis of here and what there might look like, but he doesn't have anything helpful to say. That's a different project to figure out how.
But there is the possibility, you know, and I don't know how to get to this, but in my own personal case, I really enjoy garbage day. I really enjoy getting everything together and taking the garbage can. So just like Haggland, I don't know if I could probably do it as a job, but he was lucky that he's a professor and he enjoys
Yeah.
doing that. But I can see, if things were a little different, that garbage men could enjoy what they're doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 And that's that becomes sort of part of that, socialist organization thing is, is there a way in which we can redeem is kind of a grand word, but redeem that kind of labor so that it
Right.
doesn't seem so oppressive that way.
Exactly, that we value all the labor that people do, but in our society, we somehow diminish manual labor.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And if we celebrated it more, that would change some things.
Yes.
Yeah, and he uses actually interesting some examples like that of things where the case really does sort of overlap and it's entirely about your attitude about it. Whether it's in the realm of necessity or freedom, even these little things like taking out your own garbage, or doing
Right.
work, or something that because when you're doing it, it might be kind of meditative for you, and so you're kind of
Exactly.
relaxing while you get these things done, and mind's opening up. Yeah, so he talks about it's a lot of it is attitudinal.
Yeah.
All righty.
Realm of necessity, but it's very important that Marx sometimes talked as though there was something inherently unfree about the activity of reproducing our material life, so that those activities would by definition belong to the realm of necessity. And I depart from that because it's very important, I think, for thinking emancipation, that a lot of what is socially necessary labor, like taking care of each other materially in various ways, can themselves be free activities. We can do those activities in the realm of freedom in principle. That's why the distinction, cooking food, building houses, all of those things can be done in the realm of freedom if the conditions are such that you can affirm the point and the purpose of what you're doing and why you're doing it.
And how does that in turn rest upon the argument that you make in the first half of your book about the finitude of our time?
Yeah, well, several things. First of all, it's very fundamental. Marx started with a very problem of life and life activity, and the most fundamental activity of life is to maintain itself. This is what distinguishes a living being. There's not, unlike a stone or a mountain, it's not just there. It has to do something to keep itself alive.
And you call this natural freedom.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it can take two different forms. This is just like any form of life, whether a natural life or a spiritual life, has to maintain itself, and it's only for and that means that for all living beings, they take in practice their life to be valuable as something that they are committed to sustaining. But we are unique among the animals that we know that our life is not just valuable. We can ask ourselves what we ought to value and how we ought to prioritize things, and thereby we have economical questions and economical problems in the broadest sense. And that's also why we can sacrifice our lives for something that we take to be more important than maintaining our own lives. But again, all of those questions of what is valuable, what matters, what's significant, presupposes the finitude and fragility of our ongoing activity of life. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be confronted with those questions. So that's the most fundamental link.
You mentioned earlier.
Now, let me just circle back to that spiritual freedom point, which eventually we're going to hear this from him, but while I have you, he uses the example of a seagull in the book, right? And so the seagull does what it does and it lives its life and it makes some decisions sort of about to go here or go there or do this or do that. But humans can step back from that activity of sustaining life and ask, well, is this really what I want to do? Is there something else I want to do with my time? And so that's what he calls spiritual freedom. And that's what's enabling all of this, all the existential questions we have, is that we have the spiritual freedom to step back and go, well, what is it that I want my life activity? Mm-hmm. Where the seagull just does seagull things.
Earlier, that there are not sorts of work that inherently belong to either the realm of freedom or to the realm of necessity. But you argue that these two categories are basically constitutive of human reality and cannot be, and the latter category, the one of necessity, the more disparaged category, can't be eliminated. You write, quote, eliminating socially necessary labor time is not even an intelligible goal for a free life, since the question of where to draw the distinction between necessity and freedom must itself remain a living question for anyone who leads a free life. How do you identify these two different realms if they're not given? What makes these categories real and what they are?
Yeah, again, it's a distinction that we have to make sense of ourselves. We have to discriminate between what we take to be merely means to an end and what ends in themselves, because otherwise, if there wasn't such a distinction at all, then like just anything you could conceivably do would be intrinsically meaningful for you, you know? So then it wouldn't even be intelligible that you were confronted with any questions about like what to do, because like whatever came about, there wouldn't even be any agencies. You have to make that distinction. But an important part of the book is that we can transform in very significant ways the relation between these things, and that such that like under emancipated conditions, even things that on one level kinds of work we have to do that we don't take to be intrinsically meaningful, like cleaning out the gutters or something like that. The quality of that would still change if I participate, we share that labor and I participate in that. I see like, well, this is actually I understand why we're doing this. This is meaningful and it has a point because it helps sustain this life that we are leading together. Then you can change even the quality of the work done there on necessity. But you can also be committed to like, well, we might invent technologies such that like living beings don't have to do this type of work. That sort of transformation can go very far. The only point I'm trying to make in what you quoted is that like, even with a fully achieved form of social freedom, there still has to be the ongoing question of like both individually and collectively has to be an ongoing question for us that like things that used to count for us as say ends in themselves can like lose that grip. And part of being a free being is to be able to like engage that question whether like this is still what I'm committed to doing or whether I should change the practice. And for that space of agency and decision and deliberation to even exist, that it has to be that distinction between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom.
It seems like you're also making a related argument, maybe not exactly in these terms, though, against the possibility, both the desirability and possibility of full automation. You write, quote, readings of Marx that posit a final resolution as the goal of politics, either in the form of a totalitarian state or a utopian life that would overcome finitude, betray the most important insights of his work. The goal is not to overcome finitude, but to transform qualitatively our ability to lead free lives. Even in their most ideal state, our lives will have to reckon with the risks of finitude, the risks of losing what we love and losing our ability to do what we love, since these risks are intrinsic to freedom itself. So there's like the question of full automation in terms of things like production of food and various goods and services, but then there's you're also kind of expanding this to argue against the, I think very persuasively, the argument that there could never be full automation of like things like our love lives.
Yeah, that would be terrible. And so I mean, two different strands here. Both of them are important, and there are two different sort of species of utopianism that can creep into. I mean, I don't think has any grounding in Marx, but that have had various historical fates. I mean, one is this idea, to start with the one version of the automation point, that like thinking that okay, all the stuff that we have to do to reproduce ourselves materially, there's something inherently less free about that, and we should just like automate all of that if we could. But there I say like, no, actually that loses the normative question that like, no, what we want in an emancipated form of life is being able to own the question of our priorities, but like and thereby be able to like engage the question.
And normative question just means that you're bringing ethics into it. You're asking what is the norm that should apply here. So normative just means you're talking about what is an ought to be.
But the question of maintaining your life and relationships, you know, sexual or intimate, almost has been already done because there's IVF and surrogates that allow us to maintain life without being in a relationship or having sex.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's true.
It just occurred to me.
Yeah. Well, that just goes back to it's a good reason why we don't want to automate everything.
Yeah. I agree.
Who
I agree.
really want it or need it, maybe those things are a good idea. But yeah, if everyone did it, that would just be kind of, yeah, it'd be unhuman in a way.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Or is it because a human invented these things? So
No, I think we'd want to insist the lifestyle. It's the lifestyle would not work. All right.
It would be interesting to know. Yes, sorry. It would be interesting to know if, because you come out of the capitalist system, they come out of a socialist system. That was their earth. They grew out of that. But in America, you grow really out of the capitalist system. And your freedom comes from when you have enough money. If you have no money, you're not free at all here. You sit on the, I see enough here on first rail. You end up miserably on Broadway in a big carpet bag, So there is really a difference to where you're grown up and what parents you have and how you, but especially the education, I think. They were in socialist schools. So,
no, and this is why the whole second half of the book is about why he thinks we need democratic socialism, because that's what people need. You need to create the context in which people can actually try to act on this freedom.
Yeah, because we have to think of money all the time.
Yeah, which is just a trap. So there's no freedom if you're trapped. All right. Let me do just a little bit more and then we'll stop.
Well, even if we could, which kinds of activities do we want to automate, and which kinds of activities actually taking care of the elderly or taking care of children, cooking various things, where it's actually like part of the meaning and significance of the activity is that it is a living being who cares, who does that. And that, having to do that is not a restriction on your freedom. This is another very important strand in the book. Freedom, on my account, is not freedom from work. It's not freedom from obligations. It's the freedom to commit yourself to activities that like hold you to obligations and demands, and being free is like living up to those demands or challenging them in the name of reasons and so on. So like it's really like about coming into our own as beings for whom all of these things are at stake and at issue, not being relieved from having to deal with them and from having to run the risk of failing or having to change. So that's one aspect. And then that translates into the larger scale critique of one brand of utopianism, which would think of like socialism or post-capitalism or communism as a state in which we no longer had any economic questions and when we no longer had fragility, where everything would be just by itself as it ought to be, rather than like, no, it's about freeing up our ability, do justice to our fragility, do justice to our interdependence, do justice to our arguments that we're after. But for that to still be a living practice, it still has to be something that can fall apart and might have to transform itself, where how we are maintaining ourselves is always at stake. And being free is being free to engage that question on every level, not to be released from it.
You argue that these realms of freedom and necessity are interdependent. I wonder if they're not also interpenetrating and so can't be neatly separated from one another. You write, quote, "All activities we regard as essential parts of a practical identity, as essential parts of a vocation with which we identify, belong to the realm of freedom, and the time we devote to them counts as free time." And two such practical identities you cite, I think autobiographically, are, quote, being a philosopher or being a parent, or to take an example from earlier in the interview, a podcaster. But under capitalism, and maybe even after capitalism for different reasons, how can these forms of labor, even if they are driven in part by passion or grounded in love, be entirely in the realm of freedom, given that the university and the podcast industry and the family and the home, all of these things are very much integrated, if not totally integrated, and maybe integrated in a set of very contradictory ways into the capitalist system that we live
Yeah.
under.
So the first thing to say is that under capitalism, you certainly have that issue. And because, I mean, part of another important feature of the notion of freedom that I'm advancing in the book is that to be free is to be able to see yourself in what you do and in the institutions on which you depend. So the laws and institutions and structure that I'm subjecting myself to, I should be able to recognize, even if I didn't invent them or legislate them, but I affirm the principles in light of which they are sustained. And part of why capitalism is alienating is that, like, even when we are doing things that in one sense we say like this is important and meaningful itself, the very possibility of being engaged in the activity depends on a system of wealth production that is contradictory, that is actually alien, that we can't affirm the principles of, and that leads to all sorts of contradictions. And this is part of like how I'm grounding the argument for why, like, by lights of the very commitment to freedom and being able to affirm the relations and institutions on which we depend, we need to overcome capitalism.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
talk about that more.
Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about in terms of wage labor here.
Okay, so let me go back to something more complicated and philosophical they just glossed over. Okay, so the interviewer asks, might these things interpenetrate each other? In which case they're not really different things. They look to be opposites, but they're not different. They're actually one thing, maybe with two poles. And that's an idea actually that Haggland will endorse. And it comes, that language interpenetration comes out of Hegel. So in Hegel's thinking, what we call his dialectical logic, there are actually three different laws that, and you may have heard me talk about this in different class in the past, but for the sake of everyone else, they can watch the recording. We wanted to get this out. So Hegel has three different laws, and in our culture, the one that gets the most attention is what people think of as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That something that exists engenders a contradiction. Sort of it will engender its opposite, a contradiction, and that the thesis and antithesis, that contradiction, will resolve itself into something new, a synthesis. And because Hegel's philosophy is dynamic and sort of always moving, that's not an end, it's just a step. And so the synthesis would become a new thesis and it would gender a different antithesis. Okay, so that's one of his laws of dialectics. The other is the change of quantity into quality, that if you add something you add something over and over again, you can end up with something different than what you started with. And the easiest example, oh, I just noticed the rain came here. The easiest example of that is to think about like ice forming, right? So or ice, maybe if we're going to use adding. So you have this block of ice and it's at a certain temperature. And as you add temperature to the ice, eventually the state of the ice changes and it becomes liquid. So you have a change of quantity, temperature, resulting in a change of quality. Ice becomes water. But there is a third law of dialectics for Hegel, which he calls the mutual interpenetration of opposites. And the idea there is that Hegel wants to insist, and I think literally everything that we think of as two things that are opposites of each other, they are in fact always one thing in two different aspects. And so those opposites can't exist without each other. And the example for that Marx likes to use is that capital is a collection of exploited labor. And so the capital can't exist without the labor. But the labor also the capital also organized the labor. And so the labor wouldn't really exist without the capital. And so you have these two things, you have the labor and the capital, and we talk about them and look at them as if they're two different things, two opposite things. But Hegel's saying, no, reality is actually just interconnected. And so they're really one kind of thing, but it just has these two poles to it that we can notice and call opposites of each other. So what they're getting at is the with the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, it's the same Hegelian point. They're not actually really different. They're mutually interpenetrating opposites. And so it's just going to be a continuum. And where on the continuum are you? Which is actually, I think, one of the really most sort of creative and insightful things that Hegel came up with is these laws of dialectics, because it really does help us see connections in the world and movement in the world and these deeper relationships that sometimes would seem like they're not related in a way that we could understand or act on, but in fact they are deeply related. Okay, so that was the big philosophical point I wanted to make. Have a couple minutes left. Do you all have any thoughts or questions?
I have a question that goes back to the beginning of his talk.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about new atheism
and
did not define it. Could you?
Oh, okay.
It?
Yeah, this come up in previous classes. I wasn't sure if I should interrupt for that or not, but okay. Glad that you asked. New atheists, plural, so is a term that was picked out, I think probably by a book reviewer, to identify the very similar arguments that were being made in the 1990s by the philosopher Daniel Dennett and a geneticist named Dawkins. What's Dawkins' first name? I'm forgetting that. And a neuroscientist who became famous for a while named Sam Harris. I think there might even be a fourth one. But at any rate, they all separately started writing books where they were attacking theism principally, but from my point of view are really kind of confusing what is religion and what is theism. So they think they're attacking religion, they're really attacking theism and are advocating a radical kind of atheism. But it's done primarily through this attack on arguments for the existence of God. And so Haggland is saying, well, I'm not even engaging in that argument about does God exist or not exist. I have a critique to offer about the idea, but that's not proving anything. It's just showing maybe you might think about it differently by looking at his desirability argument, where the new atheists are making this radical argument that no, what you need to do is just attack theism and suppress these anti-rational moves that religion makes. And what they all seem to embrace some kind of libertarian politics. And so that's also a big difference in how he's thinking about it. That for them, if the idea there is no God is a way of trying to talk about a maximal kind of freedom in a way that libertarians like to talk about freedom, that freedom from. So freedom from constraints, freedom from the constraints of religion, freedom from the constraints of God. Since Haggland's coming at it from a different direction, he's coming up with a very different kind of argument where his emphasis, right, is on this freedom to, freedom to create yourself, freedom to make your own decisions. And so as a result, he ends up with a different politics. He ends up with a socialist politics as opposed to their libertarian politics.
I was going to say, and my notion of libertarianism is also the freedom to die when you're sick and
that's
house,
yeah, that becomes part of the critique of libertarian thinking. Yeah, it misses the fact that we're actually socially connected beings. Yeah.
I would like to ask for something that's really personal, but there's an argument I have. My daughter stated that she'd never live in a communist country. And I said, there is no communist country.
What does that exactly mean? Yeah.
And I said, you better read Marx.
Uh-huh.
Was that a good answer?
Definitely, definitely. Have her read Haggland too.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I will.
I think he's doing a better job of explaining it. I mean, that's the problem with
Then
German
Marxist.
philosophers
Yes. Yeah.
from 100 years ago. They're really hard to read. So
Again, this
easier.
is really an amazing thought process.
Yeah, he's very creative. I'm really impressed with how he comes at all this.
And it was about when I turned, I don't know the exact age, but I'm like, I only have about 25 years left. I mean, the notion actually sunk into my being
Hmm.
that I was finite. I never thought that way, even though I'm not religious or really spiritual, but at some age.
Yeah, I think it's probably middle age.
And
Right?
and even though I'm comfortable financially, I suffer from indecision.
Hmm.
So I can see the goodness in many things
Hmm.
or the
Which one am
negative
I
in
committing
many
myself to?
things.
Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. So yeah, but
Yeah, this freedom, the freedom to doesn't tell you which thing to choose. It just
and
enables
yet,
you to choose.
right. And
Yeah.
yet some people are very decisive and know exactly
Hmm.
what they want to do, which I envy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I suspect they will have some changes along those confident people will also have some questions come up along the way.
I did read about the socialist, well, we call them socialist countries, the Scandinavian countries,
Hmm.
that part of the reason they're also designated as supposedly happy places
They
is,
are.
is because they're taxed so heavily that your decision of what to be when you grow up isn't strictly motivated by money, but by love and passion
Hmm.
at a higher percentage than, let's say, here, where I think our higher percentage would be people who do things because of the money, not because they love it.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think this is what Helena was making that point a little earlier. Yeah, that the system enables them to have the freedom to make those kinds of choices. And yeah, and it's a different world for them to live in, having that kind of freedom. That Americans just don't have. It's just money drives everything. And
Even in my own family, where uh, my sister's kids, two of them are very well off, and one's an attorney, one's in finance. And then the teacher is sort of diminished, and she's a super teacher, but of course, making, a third of what her siblings are making.
and
But
probably
she's
have a more rewarding life though at doing it.
she does, right, and she's great at it, and it's just such a shame that she's not rewarded more.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed.
But the family looks at her as sort of not as successful because
They've adopted the cultural, yeah, mores. Yeah. Well, oh, that's a shame too. Mm.
What do they actually do with compassion? Because how do we deal with it? Of course, I'm a socialist, but just last week I was with someone who had a terrible childhood, horrible, and she's in her late 50s, and she's a believer, and I thought, I'm so glad she believes.
Hmm.
What do we do in a socialist realm? Maybe she wouldn't have been in that state. No, she could have been.
Yeah.
You could have lousy parents and a lousy family, right?
Yeah.
Psychologically, what do? You can't, I don't know whether there's socialist norms to do that. You have compassion, but these are personal things.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of times I think horrible families, at least in the US, are the result of economic instability,
Yeah, which caused which? Yeah.
that you're stressed and
And part of the socialist argument would be that if having more vibrant social systems take care of people allows them to leave those bad situations, those bad family situations. And
oh, that's true.
Yeah.
Oh,
here you're dependent on that family situation.
oh, good point.
No, but
Yes.
that's why people believe in God and go to the church.
It's a different way out. Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
Haggland, I think, is sensitive to, this is what Marx called the opium of religion. And
Yeah.
we read that as a critique, and in part it is, but part of it also is he's acknowledging religion does this thing. It soothes people. And his point is not to take away the soothing, it's to take away the need to be soothed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good
That's a good
distinction.
Yeah.
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 All right. Well, we're a little past
Okay.
class time, so I should let you go.
Okay. Well,
you
a
very
question
much.
about that,
Class?
Richard,
Hmm?
because we always used to have an hour and a half. Is there a reason it's an hour?
I
They always had an hour.
in the past I've scheduled class for an hour and a half, and this time I chose to do it for an hour, and partly it was just an experiment to see
Okay.
would this work, or do we really need the more time? And so at the end of it, I'll have to
Okay.
evaluate for my next class whether I think this is working, whether we really do need more time.
Okay. Okay. Have a great week, everybody.
You all too. See you next
Yeah.
week.
Yeah.
Bye.